let's take a look at organization and identity. Identity is often defined in terms of how an institution, a social group, or an individual understands itself. This view implies that there's a core or an essence representing how an organization, group, or individual coherently defines itself. It's not about objective characteristics, but about how the people concerned sees these qualities. Identity is, like culture, used in many different ways for a variety of purposes. It is, however, fairly common to argue that organizational identity represents the form by which organizational members define themselves as a social group. Within organizational studies, the concept of identity is used also in referring to social identity and self-identity. Social identity means that a person or a group uses a social category, group, to define himself or themselves. Self-identity refers to how the individual views him or herself as an individual and what is distinct and important in terms of a sense of self. Who am I and what's important to me? The three levels mentioned, organization, group, and individual, can thus be linked. It's assumed that an organization's members shape and are shaped by the organization's identity. Answers to questions of self-identity at work are seldom a matter of purely individual responses, but are closely related to organizational cultures, as the practices and values characterizing the organization tend to guide responses. Other parts of organizational identity have a strong overlap with organizational culture study. Studies of organizational identity come very close to themes well covered in organizational culture. As organizations become ever more organic, it becomes more important to have an internalized cognitive structure of what the organization stands for and where it intends to go. Culture tends to be more internal and too complex to directly influence external communication and expression. Organizational identity is more related to a holistic view of what the organization stands for. The term corporate identity is often used with an overlapping but more externally focused view of identity issues. The overlap of organizational identity and organizational culture creates problems for people trying to distinguish between them. This is partially related to the ambiguity of the terms, partly to the variety of definitions and uses of both words. In most recent publications, authors seem to solve the problem by simply omitting or disregarding the less fashionable terminology, many favoring identity in recent years. A few try to deal with both, which seems to be a better alternative. When compared with culture, identity appears to be more word-based, explicit, and influential. Identity is more superficial, easier to consider and communicate. Identity may change more easily and also has a weaker general impact, but perhaps is more distinct. While identity refers to ideas of how people in an organization define what's distinct and unique about the organization itself, culture covers broader terrain, including meanings and beliefs about a wider set of issues. Culture is about dealing with what the organizationally relevant world looks like, including, but not exclusively, focusing on identity issues around who we are and what's distinct for us and what we identify with. There are other views on the relationship between culture and identity. While identity is something that the individuals in the organizations decide, culture has much less of this quality. Cultural meanings are so distributed and weaved into a complex system of meanings that they're seldom defined and often very difficult to fully grasp and understand. This view can be complicated somewhat by pointing at aspects of culture that can sometimes be espoused and by recognizing that identity issues may also involve ambivalence, making culture and identity less dissimilar in this respect. But as stated, culture tends to be less easy to understand and espouse, identity being more so. What's the relationship between the aspects of the concepts of organizational culture and identity? On the overall level, organizational culture provides the framework for identity formation projects. At the same time, identity provides important reference points and how to relate to various cultural meanings. Identity expressions, if well grounded in existing cultural meanings, can also influence and change cultural meanings themselves. The relationship between culture and identity is complicated by the multitudes of views in many organizations. In organizations, there's not necessarily one homogeneous culture, but often a variety of cultural orientations, some shared broadly, others distinct for various groups. Understandings of organization as a whole may vary among groups. Not all agree upon their view of organizational identity, and people may also orient themselves to other social units like a division or a department. Cultural themes like the view of customers, a new product, leadership ideals, or ethical commitments then may appeal to different social groups. In the same organization, other themes may lead to other identity-culture interplays. The point here is that identity and identification as well as cultural orientations are multiple and shifting, not just one organizational identity and one organizational culture standing in a simple relation to each other. Identity themes drive how people relate to the variety of cultural orientations available. The view of identity and culture varying within the organizational context can be pushed further. Some basic questions can be raised around the very idea of an organizational identity and the organization as a whole offering a strong source of identification for most people. Critics remark that contemporary organizations and individuals may be more fragmented and flexible than the phrase organizational identity would suggest, particularly in our dynamic world. But it's an open question whether members normally construct a common perception of their organization as having certain key characteristics or as being distinctive from other organizations in some respect. Not all organizations are seen as particularly original or easy to portray in terms of a few key characteristics, and some are not likely to attract much positive sentiment from their employees. Clearly, there's a strong variation between groups of people within many organizations in these respects, and it's important to consider this variation. Any well-functioning organization needs at least some sense of belonging and positive sentiment among employees. For some time, there's been a strong interest in identity issues in management and organization. Identity is related to increasingly significant themes such as image and branding. Some aspects of organizational identity, like emphasizing the collective, are similar to organizational culture. However, the identity focus on who we are and what's distinct for us, being more narrow in a specific theme, is different from culture. Culture works partly through assumptions, values, and meanings that people tend to take for granted and that inform their ways of relating to work. Identification is more a matter of the degree to which people clearly and consciously define themselves through their affiliation with the organization or workplace. There are diverse opinions about certain key characteristics and understandings of organizational identification.